We have a grant from Carolina Seminars for our series Bring on the Heat, which is focused on issues facing women during the midlife. And today we are excited to focus on sleep in midlife. I think that sleep dysregulation is something that can happen across the lifespan for a whole host of reasons, stress being an important one of those. But we know that sleep changes pretty dramatically during the transition to menopause, and that can often happen sort of unexpectedly, with or without hot flashes, for women of a certain age. So I'm glad that you're joining us here today. We have two wonderful experts. Dr. Margo Nathan is a psychiatrist at the UNC School of Medicine, and Dr. Parisa Kaliush is a clinical psychologist and a postdoctoral fellow with our program, and is focusing on sleep. So we'll talk about, at the end, we'll talk about our clinic and ways that you can come see us if you're struggling with sleep, and any other issues related to the menopause transition. But today we hope to provide some practical tips and ideas about how to support sleep during this time, because I know that many are experiencing not only the transition to menopause, but also stress in these times. So it's a good time for us to be talking about sleep. So I will turn it over to Dr. Nathan in just 1 second. I just want to also let you know at the end, we'll have lots of time for question and answer. And you can put questions in the chat throughout our session today, and we will try to get to all of your questions at the end. It's also possible, it doesn't look like we're going to have such a huge number of people that we won't be able to have you just unmute and ask your questions at the end as well. Part of our goal here is to build community. And so that's why we're doing this as a regular Zoom meeting instead of as a webinar, so that you can see each other and talk to one another during this session today as well. If you have ideas about how you'd like us or things you'd like us to cover, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have staff working on this, and we're happy to go in lots of different directions. A lot of the seminars that we've done have been in response to requests from our community of folks who attend these sessions. So thank you for that. We will put a link in the chat at the end for you to fill out a survey, and that's another way you can share your experiences with us. Let us know what you'd like to see us do, what you liked about this session and didn't. And that being said, because this is a regular Zoom meeting, everyone can see each other on screen and your names. And so if that's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you can keep your video off. Otherwise, please feel free to turn it on. And you can also change your screen name today if you prefer not to have your name shown. So just some things to keep in mind, but I think through our sessions doing both in person and virtual things, people have appreciated getting into contact with one another and knowing that a lot of other people are experiencing the same things or similar things to what you are. We do have an upcoming in-person event in partnership with Franklin Street Yoga. And so we'll be sending out information about that. So now that the weather is getting colder, come join us for some body warming exercises through yoga, and we'll learn to relax together. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nathan.
Thanks, Dr. Schiller, and welcome to everyone. We're really excited to be able to meet with you all today, and we hope that this is really more of a discussion than a talk, so that we can kind of learn from each other and talk about something that's just really important to all of our health. So, so with that, I'm gonna, oops, there we go. So the first thing is, we really do welcome all of your questions and very much want this to be a discussion at the end. So if there are questions you have related to sleep, comments, general concepts, feel free to put them in the chat and we will try to get to everything. We also, as clinicians, learn from you all. And so if there's ways we can be doing more within our own communities to support you, that's very helpful feedback for us. And again, we want this to be about bringing sort of community together and all learning, hopefully. So kind of big picture, we'll start the session with really just some updated information about what do we know about sleep during menopause, a little bit of some of the symptoms that sleep disturbance can present with, why do we think this happens, a little bit on the physiology, what are some risk factors for poor sleep during menopause. I'll talk a little bit about treatment options, kind of focusing more on medication options, hormonal options, and then shift over to Parisa, who will go through some behavioral approaches to sleep management and walk you through a nice sort of like interactive exercise along, side the teaching. So hopefully this is informative and also practically quite helpful. And then we'll end the last third of the meeting, hopefully with some discussion. So just as a reminder and sort of level setting, there are some clusters of symptoms that just tend to happen with the menopause transition. If you've come to some of our earlier sessions, you've heard us talk about weight changes, mood symptoms, hormonal symptoms like hot flashes, sometimes called vasomotor symptoms. But I do want to sort of highlight today that a core feature that can also interact with a lot of these other symptoms is sleep disturbance. And we know this to be true not just by our own experiences as people, but fortunately in this space, we are lucky to have a number of larger studies that I've listed on the left that have kind of followed women across the menopausal transition and tried to characterize like what are the symptoms that can happen with menopause, which are kind of more common, which are more distressing and so forth. And so we know this cluster is prominent for many people. So while there's many symptoms that can come up with menopause, I'm really going to spend most of the time today highlighting sleep and then the interaction with hot flashes, stress, as Dr. Schiller mentioned, and then mood symptoms. So first sort of main concept is that sleep disturbance is very common during menopause. It's hard to kind of emphasize that enough, but if we want to put some numbers behind it, about 40 to 69, maybe 70% of women describe some sleep disturbance during this reproductive transition. And that can mean slightly different things to different people. But if you're sitting in this room and sort of saying, I wasn't sure if it was just me or if it was others, know that this is a very, very common complaint during this reproductive transition specifically. In addition, about a smaller group, maybe like 4 to sort of 40% of women may also be diagnosed with a primary insomnia disorder. So what I mean by that is like a full sleep disorder, like obstructive sleep apnea, restless leg symptoms, and so forth. Risk for those also do increase during the menopause transition. And regardless of whether you fit into one box or both boxes, we know that sleep disturbance can be related to a major source of functional impairment, can impact relationships, ability to go to work, ability to parent, and so forth. So we know this does have a major impact on a lot of women. I also want to emphasize that sleep disturbance can occur regardless of how you transition to menopause, whether it's surgical or because you're taking medication that can trigger the menopause transition, or what we sometimes refer to as like natural menopause. In all of these circumstances, sleep disturbance really is quite common. And it may occur even if you have no history of prior sleep difficulty in other phases of your life. So what does sleep tend to look like during menopause? We've just talked about how it is disturbed for many people, but what does that actually mean? And we know that middle insomnia is probably the most common presentation or symptom constellation with the sleep disturbance. So what do I mean by middle insomnia? So when we think about sleep, we sort of divide it into chunks of the night. So we refer to like early insomnia as trouble falling asleep. Middle insomnia is trouble staying asleep. So we're that middle portion of the night. And then late insomnia, meaning you wake up too soon or kind of well before your alarm clock intends to go off. So with menopause, it is often a sleep fragmentation issue or a sleep interruption issue is often the best way to describe it. So you may be able to fall asleep, but then you wake up 2 hours later, you're up for a little bit, then you go back to sleep, then you wake up again, you're up for a little bit, then you go back to sleep. So you may be spending a large chunk of time in bed, maybe even 9 or 10 hours, but you're really only sleeping in 2 or 3 hour chunks. Um, and this can sometimes lead to sort of increased time awake in the middle of the night, which from a research standpoint is sometimes described as wake time after sleep onset or WASO. Um, this can be a little bit tough to get at. So if your clinician asks you, well, how much time are you spending in bed? You might say 9 or 10 hours, which sounds like a lot. But the reality is there's only a little bit of sleep happening in a consolidated way during that time. Women also report related to menopause, not surprisingly, in addition to fragmentation, trouble with sleep quality. So maybe spending a lot of time in bed, but waking up and not feeling refreshed or not feeling restored. And that overall the quality of their sleep is just lower compared to before menopause. As I mentioned previously, because of some of the hormone changes that happen with menopause, there is an increased risk of some of these primary insomnia disorders. I mentioned that, hopefully not to scare people, but just to note if you are having some sleep difficulty, to make sure you bring it up with your primary clinician, just so that they can consider these when they're thinking about how best to support you and if any kind of additional testing is needed. So we've talked about, unfortunately, how common sleep disturbance is related to menopause, but what contributes to this or what makes someone at slightly higher risk? So it used to be thought that hot flashes, sleep disturbance, and depression were linearly related. So meaning that hot flashes cause people to have trouble sleeping, which then led to lower mood. And we now know that the interrelationship of these factors is actually much more complex. So we sort of think of these factors as like triangulating in some ways. And the reason I describe it like this is while it is common if you have severe hot flashes to wake up more at night and have sleep disturbance, not everyone does. So there are certainly women who feel like they have terrible sleep during menopause, but don't necessarily have hot flashes or only have kind of mild or daytime hot flashes and yet are sleeping terribly at night. So you don't have to have one to have the other. And sometimes this kind of intersects with mood symptoms and sometimes not. Um, Also, just to kind of highlight that depressive symptoms are really quite common, which I think you've heard us mention several times during the course of these webinars. Sometimes depressive is not a word that resonates with a lot of people. Sometimes it's feeling on edge or anxious or irritable. I sometimes describe this as like a period of mood brittleness or sort of feeling more easily overwhelmed. Often those kinds of symptoms of feeling not quite right can also co-occur with sleep disturbance, and often these concepts are bidirectionally related. One doesn't necessarily cause the other. Again, I think of them as kind of like triangulating or intersecting, but just knowing that they often do co-occur. And the reason this is important is when we're thinking about treatment and sort of ways to support women, if we can address these symptoms together, that often serves our patients a little bit better. To mention hot flashes, which for many women, they experience kind of the classic hot flash, which is the sort of like facial and trunk redness and feeling of warmth that comes on suddenly, sometimes almost like a panic attack. For others, it's more of like temperature dysregulation, feeling cold when you feel like you shouldn't feel cold, warm when you shouldn't feel warm, and so forth. About 60% of women will experience some symptoms like that, maybe even more. And often these symptoms can persist even years after their last menstrual period. So again, sort of a longer set of symptoms. As we mentioned before, hot flashes are sometimes linked to sleep disturbance, sometimes linked to awakenings at night, but not always. And so if you don't have hot flashes, but you feel like your sleep has not been going well and you're kind of wondering about that, there very much may be something there. Just a couple of quick notes on what's some of the biology behind this risk for sleep changes during the menopause transition. So, interestingly, a lot of the sort of neuroscience, a lot of the neural pathways that regulate temperature, regulate our circadian pattern, so like when to fall asleep at night, and regulate mood probably intersect around the hypothalamus, the orbital frontal cortex, and so forth. So, these symptoms often live in similar brain regions. And so it's not surprising that they can kind of intersect in the way that we experience them. We also know that there are receptors for the common sort of women's hormones like estrogen and to some degree progesterone as well on these neural areas. And so it sort of makes sense that as our hormones shift, the impact on these neural structures can be felt as well. Interestingly, we've got some good, more recent research showing that aging and sort of particularly around the most common time of the menopausal transition, so kind of 40s, 50s, is linked to decreasing melatonin levels. Melatonin is a hormone that can regulate your sleep cycle and circadian rhythm. I mentioned this not because adding melatonin back necessarily fixes all of this, which is an important concept to share, but just to sort of let you know that there are some biological changes that probably do intersect to contribute to this sleep disturbance. And I also just wanted to highlight here a newer concept that I think we're all really excited about in this space. There's a set of neural structures or neurons called the candy neurons, which have to do with temperature regulation. And there's some really interesting new data coming out that these neurons may be impacted and may be involved in the pathophysiology of hot flashes. And they also exist in the area of the hypothalamus, which is similar to where these other pathways are located. And so some of the newer treatments that are non-hormonal and support hot flashes and so forth may actually get at this biology. So I mentioned this just to provide some hope that hopefully over the next few years, we will have some newer and different treatments targeting these symptoms. Um, Also, just to note a little more about some of the hormone patterns that can be related to sleep disturbance during menopause. We have some pretty convincing data at this point that lower estrogen is linked to sleep changes. So, with mood symptoms, you may have heard us talk about during some of the earlier webinars that fluctuation or kind of the roller coastering of estrogen and estradiol can sometimes trigger mood symptoms. With sleep, it may be that, but also just there being less estrogen circulating probably does contribute to these awakenings and sleep disturbance. And this is meaningful, again, when we're thinking about treatment options. And so on the right, these graphs are pretty messy, but just to kind of highlight in the top left, if you can see my cursor. So essentially we see more awakenings or waking more at night with lower estrogen levels. And that's why you get this kind of steep line here. The data is a little bit more mixed with progesterone, which is sort of interesting. I don't know if anyone in the audience has had the experience of taking progesterone and feeling sleepy after taking it because it is sometimes given during menopause, both for uterine protection if someone's taking estrogen, but also to support sleep. And while it can be helpful for some, it is not necessarily helpful for everyone when it comes to sleep. And so if you don't have the effect that you expect, not to worry. There can certainly be sort of a variety of experiences with progesterone out there, and sometimes can also trigger some mood symptoms as well. Um, while this is a common sort of set of symptoms and complaints that many women have related to menopause, one of the reasons we really want to kind of keep thinking about treating and better supporting women with sleep disturbance related to menopause is these symptoms can be quite impactful on our daily lives. So, we talked a little bit about how feeling sleep deprived can contribute to difficulty with parenting, with working, with just functioning in general. We also have some good recent data that suggests that our cognition is potentially impacted. So, our attention to detail, our reaction time, our working memory may be impacted from sleep disturbance as well, which is what this somewhat messy slide shows essentially is that when we fragment sleep, meaning we have those kind of more awakenings at night, we actually see more lapses in attention and longer reaction time and so forth. So treating sleep is sometimes a good way to actually support cognition during the day. And that's one of the, I would say, most common questions we get in our clinic is, I've hit menopause, I feel like my attention's not quite as good, or I'm not feeling as mentally sharp as I used to be, like, what can I do? And I'll often say, well, can we also talk about your sleep? How's that going? How are you sleeping at night? How many hours are you getting in a row? And sometimes that's a point of intervention to improve focus and so forth as well. So very briefly, what are some of the buckets of options we have to manage these symptoms? Um, I always like to think about sort of the broad menu of options and sort of three different main buckets that we can focus on are our psychiatric and sleep medicines, our hormonal treatments, most commonly menopausal hormone therapy, and then supplements, and then behavioral modifications, behavioral therapy, which arguably has some of the best data in supporting sleep during the menopausal transition, which Parisa will talk about pretty soon, as well as environmental changes like reducing alcohol, being thoughtful about caffeine, and so forth. So this is not meant to be like an exhaustive description of all of the treatments that are out there, but just to give you a sense of how we think about medication use to address sleep disturbance during menopause. And if there's specific questions, happy to answer them. And we'll talk about some of the clinical resources if you're wanting more information. So when we think about the sort of psychiatric or sleep medicine bucket, sometimes we want to think about medications that target the mood symptoms as well as the hot flashes, which can be the serotonergic antidepressants. We have antidepressants that are also a little bit sedating as a side effect, and we sometimes leverage that side effect to treat sleep during this reproductive transition. And then there's a variety of other non-antidepressant medications that are sometimes prescribed both to help with hot flashes like gabapentin or clonidine or pregabalin, which is another name for Lyrica, that can also support sleep at the same time. So again, trying to think about treatments that address a multitude of symptoms with one medicine versus kind of a medicine for each symptom, if that makes sense. We also have the sleep medications. So I've just noted on there the Z drugs like Ambien and so forth, because they have been studied for menopausal sleep disturbance. I think as a psychiatrist, we sometimes worry about some of the side effects of these medicines. And so they're not necessarily our first choice, but they are out there and they are an option. And then there's a new class of medications called the orexin antagonists. Orexin is a hormone that promotes wakefulness, and these newer medicines block that hormone to hopefully keep people asleep. So they do a better job sometimes of helping people consolidate their sleep in the middle of the night, and they can be a helpful option. Often these medicines have side effects, and so it's not a one size fits all. So definitely something to talk to your clinician about if you are potentially interested in a medication, to think about what's kind of the best fit for you. And then hormonal options. So as I mentioned, lower estrogen has definitely been linked to more sleep fragmentation related to the menopause condition and transition. And so sometimes thinking about menopausal hormone therapy, if it's makes sense for other reasons, and if there's not other concerns with taking it, can be very helpful at addressing sleep, as well as energy and some of the cognitive symptoms that can happen related to sleep disturbance during this transition. And then briefly to mention, there is also a newer class of medicine called the NK3 or neurokinin blockers, or Veoza is the brand name of that I've mentioned down here, that can target hot flashes, which are non-hormonal and therefore can support sleep from that angle. So there's a number of medications. I think for many, this can feel quite overwhelming because there's so many different options out there. And sometimes it's hard to know, well, what's the one that I should think about, what makes the most sense for me? And so, I would encourage you, if you have any questions, certainly bring them up here, but also bring them back to your primary care doctor, and we can, continue the discussion with them. I think Parisa might sort of run through some of this during her section, but just a note that there's lots of options out there in terms of wearable devices. I've sort of highlighted here the Oura Ring, and then Fitbit, as well as apps that can be helpful in helping you track your sleep, helping you sort of promote some interventions and so forth for your sleep. And sometimes, again, it can feel a little bit overwhelming with the number of options that are out there. And we'll talk a little bit about how these can be helpful adjuncts. And of course, if you have any experience or questions about this, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can certainly try to address them. And with that, I will turn it over.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So hi, everyone. My name is Parisa Kaliush, and I'm excited to be sharing some behavioral strategies that, like Dr. Nathan shared, have been shown pretty consistently to be really effective and feasible at alleviating some of these concerns and areas of distress that Dr. Nathan has outlined. And I hope that some of the strategies that we talk about today do feel feasible to begin implementing even today. And so we can go to the next slide. because yeah, I guess I don't have control, do I? Okay, awesome. So the strategies that I'll be talking about today are informed by cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. This treatment is really the gold standard treatment for insomnia and related sleep problems. And I actually want to take a step back and reiterate that those buckets of treatment options that Dr. Nathan outlined, medications, hormone therapy related options, behavioral modifications. These are not mutually exclusive. Pick one and you can only do that one. These can all be used in combination when you consult with your doctor. And so the elements of CBTI that I'd like to review with you all today entail environmental modifications, maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, and incorporating more routine into your sleep-wake schedule, strengthening this association for your brain and your body that bed equals sleep. When I hit the bed, I sleep. And concluding with mindfulness and acceptance. And so, like I said, these elements are informed by CBTI, but a quick note about that last element, mindfulness and acceptance, it really hasn't been until recently that providers have started to incorporate mindfulness and acceptance-based practices into their insomnia and sleep-related work, particularly during these reproductive life transitions like menopause, like some of the work we also do in our clinic with people during pregnancy and postpartum, because there are a lot of factors contributing to sleep disturbances, some of which we have more or less control over. And so that's a really important component that I hope everyone finds some value from learning about today. We can go to the next one. I'll break each one down. So starting with environmental modifications, each of these elements that I'll go through really are grounded in the biological, the pathophysiological processes and research that Dr. Nathan mentioned already, starting with the importance of doing our best to limit, reduce, completely eliminate any light exposure during the period which you want to sleep, right? Dr. Nathan mentioned how research is indicating that as we age, melatonin production goes down. Melatonin is that thing you need to help prompt sleepiness. It's really important for sleep. And so if we're not producing as much melatonin as maybe we used to, light exposure is actually something that in part can influence melatonin production. So this is one environmental modification that we need to be thinking about. Breathable, cool fabrics, keeping a second set of pajamas next to your bed. You know, it may sound silly, and again, in isolation, just wearing breathable, cool fabrics isn't going to solve all your sleep concerns. But in conjunction with everything else, this hopefully is one feasible thing that you can start sooner rather than later. Holidays are coming up. Gift giving, if you are receiving gifts from people and they want to know what you want, ask for linen sheets, linen pajamas. Maybe people can put in the chat if they have any brands that they like. I highly recommend Bed Threads. They're based out of Australia, and I just got a Black Friday email from them that I had to quickly close out because I was getting distracted before this webinar. So once I went linen, I have not gone back. I'm going to be completely honest. Fan, cooling pad, cooling pillows, sound machine, right? A sound machine isn't going to directly address some of these vasomotor, hot flash symptoms or other things, but a sound machine may be helpful if you're someone who is waking up multiple times in the middle of the night because of other external sounds that are waking you up. Sound machine can be helpful to reduce some of that external noise and distraction. Caffeine and alcohol consumption is something that Dr. Nathan mentioned already as well. Bed threads. I'm kind of seeing the chat as it pops up. Bed threads. A little pricey, but their sales are great. Remove pets and partners in parentheses from the bed. Another factor to consider, I have there an image of a book written by Dr. Wendy Troxel, who I worked with for a brief period of time while I was at the University of Utah before coming to UNC. And she and her colleagues are huge advocates for having the whole bed to yourself. And working with your partners to have a sleep arrangement that facilitates that. They're not a sponsor. That's great. I will say, again, I'm coming from personal experience here. When my partner and I invested in a king size bed, that in combination with my linen pajamas and linen sheets actually significantly improved my sleep quality, more so than I thought it would. I have this final point here about monitoring factors that influence your sleep, right? It's going to vary from one person to the next. Some of those sleep apps and monitoring devices that Dr. Nathan brought up, that could be a good place to start. And I'm also, and I think others in our clinic are a huge fan of just paper and pencil and keeping a log for yourself. So I have some paper pencil resources that I use with my clients that perhaps we can share with you all afterwards. Any other resources? Oh, we can go to the next one. Okay, consistent sleep schedule and routines. This is really, really important here. Dr. Nathan also mentioned briefly this idea of areas of your brain during the menopause transition changing that are related to things like your circadian rhythm, right? Your circadian rhythm is your body's kind of 24-hour clock that helps regulate when you're awake and when you're asleep. And absolutely, that is a biological process that can be influenced by external things, by our behaviors. And so again, these strategies are grounded in these biological processes and research on the pathophysiology of sleep disturbance. And so if you go to the next slide, Dr. Nathan, thank you. When I'm working with my clients on starting to establish consistency in their sleep and their wake, I always start with the wake time, okay? That having a consistent wake time kind of is like your body's pulse. That is a really powerful way to help your body find a consistent rhythm. And so if I invite you now, as I'm talking through some of these elements, to be thinking to yourself right now, what time do I wake up in the morning? Sometimes it's easier to start there too instead of bedtime because we have to wake for certain obligations like work or childcare demands. And so I want you to be thinking to yourself now, what time do I want to wake up in the morning? And really stick with that time consistently over the course of the week. Maybe plus minus an hour wiggle room on the weekends, but this is really important. And we often, this third bullet point here, light, water, exercise. We oftentimes, when we're experiencing sleep problems, we think about the nighttime. What can I be doing during the nighttime to help get my body ready for sleep? And we forget that it actually can be really effective and powerful to have a routine when we wake up as well. And so a wake time routine, we have this trifecta here of light exposure, drinking water, and finding ways to incorporate some sort of physical movement into your morning when you wake up. I have your exercise, but I don't mean you have to get to the gym and do some intense hour-long workout. I really just mean when you wake up, can you do a little bit of light stretching, even while you're still in your bed? If you have a dog, taking your dog for a walk. Having these elements as part of your wake time routine can be really powerful over time to help set a consistent rhythm for your body. And so at the end, if we have time, I'd love to hear if other people have thought about this idea of prioritizing a wake time routine and what other ideas people have so we can share our collective knowledge. I have here a point about naps as well, of really trying our best to avoid napping within 6 to 8 hours of your bedtime. We can talk more about that at the end if there's time, but I'm actually going to use this moment to take a step back and again reiterate that these sleep strategies are informed by cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. For those of you who feel as if you're really experiencing some of these sleep problems and you want to talk to your doctor about it, and you have never done full-blown CBTI with a therapist, I cannot emphasize enough how important and helpful that can be to go through a course of CBTI with a therapist who's been trained in that modality, who's been trained in that treatment. It's typically brief, maybe 6 to 8 sessions. And that way you can learn all of these tools in a specific order and with the support of your therapist, and then have those tools for the rest of time afterwards. It's not meant to be a lifelong therapy, but it can be really helpful to do it with the support of a therapist. If we go to the next slide. Like I said, wind down routine, or bedtime routine, some people call it, I call it a wind down routine. We talk about, we learn, those who have had children, we learn about the importance of a wind down routine or a bedtime routine for our infants, for our kids. And for some reason, as we become adults, we like lose sight of a wind down routine and cueing our body for sleep. And it's really, really important as well. And so a few elements that I want to emphasize, at least just today, is limiting your bedtime routine to just about 30 to maybe 60 minutes or an hour before your bedtime. Some people actually go longer than that, and that can be counterproductive. There's no need to have a wind down routine longer than 30 to 60 minutes. But during this time, it is important to be eliminating any kind of light exposure. Remember what I talked about earlier with helping the fact that we're just not producing as much melatonin during this time. So we want to eliminate electronic use, eliminate light exposure as much as possible. And here's the thing too, do not go to bed if you're not tired. So while I have both of these on the slide at the same time, wake time and wind down or your bedtime, the one I really want you to stick consistent to, like a pulse every day, is your wake time. Your bedtime, frankly, when I work with my sleep therapy clients, I don't place that much emphasis on their bedtime, other than it's nice to have a consistent schedule. But if you're not tired, I don't want you sitting up in your bed or lying awake in your bed, frustrated, trying to sleep. And that actually can be a good segue to the next slide, Dr. Nathan. So this idea of bed equals sleep and sex. I don't know if Bring on the Heat has a whole webinar related to sexual health and sexual, but that's really important too. Not what we're focusing on today. So I just put it in parentheses. I feel like we should make a bumper sticker that says bed is for sleep and sex, and everyone can have it on their cars. So this idea of your brain and your body understanding that when I'm in bed, I sleep. And so anything else other than sleep, ideally, you are not doing it in the bed. So even when we talk about a wind down routine, like reading, doing some low key, low stimulating, pampering activities, ideally those things are happening outside of your bed. In general, rule of thumb, if you find that you're awake in bed for more than 25 minutes. And that's a very specific number. And when I work with sleep therapy clients, I'm not specific about it. I think we all can relate to this experience of lying awake in bed and suddenly having the thought, I've been awake longer than I'd like to be. Like, this has been too long. It doesn't feel good. When that comes up, that's a good indication that it's time to, point number one, get out of bed if possible. I have there a second sub point, or at least change your body position. That relates a lot to some of my work with pregnant and postpartum folks who it's just really uncomfortable and hard to get out of bed during certain stages of life. And so if that's the case, I tend to be a more flexible therapist, but I at least want you changing your body position from lying down. But gold standard is to get out of bed and then go do something that's relaxing, low key, kind of like a mini version of your wind down routine, re-cueing your body for sleep again. This can be a frustrating process. Again, why it's so helpful to do this with the support of a therapist. But let me tell you these particular strategies are some of the most powerful behavioral strategies for helping your body find a consistent rhythm. And when you're in bed, you're actually sleeping. For myself and others with whom I've worked, We found it really helpful, honestly, to place like a visual reminder. And by that, I mean just like a Post-it note or an index card next to my bed that says something like, if you're awake, get up, whatever motivates you. Maybe put some hearts or something so it's not so punishing. Because my last point there is I want you, if at all possible, to make this experience as comforting as possible. This is not meant to be punishing. Perhaps creating a cozy space elsewhere in your home that has a blanket, slippers, your book, a nice smelling candle, right? Not another place where you're sleeping. We don't want you sleeping in this other place. We want you sleeping in bed, but kind of like a cozy, comforting place to reset. All right, next slide. Because I want to make sure we have time for discussion and questions at the end. So ending with this final element, like I said, mindfulness and acceptance. I'm curious to hear at the end about anybody who's familiar with the concept of mindfulness or actually engages in mindfulness practices. For instance, like meditation, that's a form of mindfulness. But here in our clinic and in a lot of our work, we define mindfulness broadly as paying attention to the present moment on purpose, without judgment and without attachment. And by without attachment, I mean this idea that when I hone in on what I'm experiencing in this moment, understanding, helping myself understand that it won't last forever. It likely will be fleeting, both positive and negative experiences. So that's part of mindfulness practice as well. And this is something I'd like for us to practice together in just a moment, actually, if people are willing. How does mindfulness relate to your sleep, though? The opposite of mindfulness, we could say, is mindlessness, right? Or your mind just kind of running on autopilot, going in all sorts of directions, doing its own thing. That's not inherently a bad thing. This idea of mind being on autopilot allows us to multitask, right? Allows me to drive to work while I'm talking to my father, who calls me every single morning on Bluetooth, right? It allows us to do multiple things at the same time. That's not inherently a bad thing, but it also can mean that when we are experiencing anxious thoughts or worries about things, or you wake up in the middle of the night multiple times, like Dr. Nathan was explaining, that sleep fragmentation. I wake up and I have trouble falling back asleep, wake up, have trouble falling back asleep. When we wake up in the middle of the night, more often than not, it's hard to fall back asleep because our mind starts racing, worrying about the things that are coming up the next day, or maybe not even worrying. Our mind is just distracted, thinking about all the things that just happened. Wouldn't it be nice to say, hey, mind, come back? Not now. Now's not the time to be thinking about all these things. We want to be sleeping. And mindfulness practice is something, again, especially with the support of a therapist or your doctor, is a skill that you can practice every day that actually will strengthen your mind's ability to recognize we're getting distracted. Let's come back in. We're getting distracted. Let's come back in. And that really has been shown. There's been some exciting research lately showing that this is one of the most helpful components for some of these nighttime awakenings. And so with that, given that we're almost finished, Dr. Nathan, if you wouldn't mind going to the last slide, and then I can lead us through a final practice. I have this idea of acceptance here as well, letting go of the struggle to change something in the moment. Now, this does not at all mean that I want you all to leave today just accepting your sleep is going to suck during the menopause transition. Just let it go. You can't change anything. That's not the point here at all. What I want you to take from this is these middle of the night moments where you really would rather be sleeping. That can feel so frustrating and so defeating, and we get down on ourselves about it. What if instead we were able to practice mindfulness, hone our attention back in, and then say something a little kinder to ourselves, like, I'm trying my best right now, or this won't last forever. It sucks right now, and it's okay. Whatever that mantra is. And if there's time, we can talk more about that at the end. But for now, just to end our time with these behavioral strategies, if you're willing, I'm going to do it with you. I invite us all to do just a 1-minute mindfulness exercise. And if you like it, I would love for you to practice this later again today, practice it tomorrow. But to get started, I always find it helpful to adjust my position. I'm seated right now. So if you're seated, I invite you to get in a more comfortable seated position where your back is straight, but not so straight that it's uncomfortable. You're alert. You can hear my voice, and already I'm noticing that my eyes are beginning to close. You are welcome to close your eyes with me or leave them open, but resting gently somewhere. And also during a brief mindfulness practice, I find it helpful to rest my hands on the tops of my thighs with my palms facing upward. In therapy, we sometimes call that willing hands. Having our palms facing upward can help us feel more open to practicing something in the moment.
Some people thought this wasn't intention, but the same two ravens also appeared.
Observing, this is mindfulness. That actually was beautiful. Observing when your mind gets distracted by a noise, and then you just bring it back in. It was almost like we planned that. And so taking a moment with me right now to observe a sound around you that perhaps you didn't notice before. For me, it was a dog that just barked outside of my home. Maybe it's the hum of your electronic device. Maybe it's my voice. Bringing your attention to a sound that you didn't notice before. And if you notice that your mind wanders away from that sound to another thought, just observe that without judgment and bring your mind back, kind of like you're extending a hand to gently bring your attention back. Maybe moving on to another sound that you may hear. Go ahead and take a breath in and out. That helps you settle a little more into your present space. And when you're ready, after another breath in and out, if your eyes are closed, you're welcome to open them and reconnect with us back here. Wiggle your fingers if your palms were resting on your thighs. And so, gosh, that was a really, really brief mindfulness exercise. And that's okay. Even if you just take 3 seconds to pause and listen for something you didn't notice before, or look at something in your space that you didn't notice before, that's you intentionally bringing your mind, focusing on one particular thing. And over time, that can help us do that more effectively when we're waking up, in the middle of the night.
Yay, Ryan.
We can go ahead and move on to the final slides to close out, and happy to talk about that more at the end if people have more questions, but thank you.
All right, this is our Women's Mood Disorders Clinic. Thank you, Dr. Kaliush, for that exercise. It was relaxing. Even for me, I'm usually the one leading the exercise instead of participating in the exercise, and it was nice. It was a nice little break. So thank you for that. So this is our Midlife Women's Clinic at UNC. You can see some familiar faces and outdated headshots on this slide, but we have a good team of folks here with a number of people, psychiatrists, psychologists, contributing, as well as the OBGYNs that we work closely with. And we provide consultations, including reproductive and psychiatric evaluation, recommendations for managing symptoms, including insomnia. Some of our folks are on the call today who provide these treatments, and short-term behavioral interventions as well. So You can find more information about us a little bit online. There's not a lot there, and it's kind of hard to find, to be honest. We're working on improving our website, but you can call the clinic and ask to be scheduled for an appointment, either for therapy or medication or both. And we tend not to have a terribly long wait list. All right, go ahead. Yep, okay. And then these are some of the folks, and this is just like a small subset at this point of folks in OBGYN who are working with us as well. There are some folks that focus more on menopause. You can see them along the top row. And then Dr. Schiff is one of my primary research collaborators, who also is a gynecologic surgeon, and helps manage all sorts of issues that folks are having as they transition to menopause. All right, I think we have one more. Okay, this is our research study. Right now we're trying to understand how hormones improve mood during the menopause transition. So if you're between the ages of 44 and 55, you may be eligible for our study. You can learn more by clicking a quick picture of our QR code there, or going to our website, peepstudy.org, to learn more. And yeah, we just love it if you could take a look at participating in our study. This is funded by the National Institutes of Health, and all of our studies are really focused on trying to improve quality of life in women as they transition to menopause. All right,